In the harsh expanse of the New Mexico territory, where survival was measured in drops of water and trust could get you killed, a stubborn homesteader made a decision that defied all frontier logic. She offered food and shelter to a wounded Apache warrior when others would have reached for a rifle. But she couldn't have known that by extending this simple mercy, she would transform her vulnerable homestead into ground that no man dared to trespass, and perhaps change the course of her own destiny. The drought had a weight to it, heavy and relentless. It pressed down on the valley like a curse, turning fertile soil to powder, withering crops before they could bear fruit, and stealing hope with each cloudless dawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried nothing but dust and the distant howling of coyotes hunting. For what little life remained, Rebecca Holbrook stood at the edge of her failing homestead, the hand-carved wooden bucket hanging empty at her side. At 42, the harsh sun had weathered her once smooth skin, and work had toughened her slender fingers into calloused tools. Her dark hair, now streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. She squinted against the glare, surveying what remained of her dream, a modest cabin, a half-empty barn, and fields that were more dust than soil. The well was running dry. Another few weeks, maybe less, and there would be nothing, no water for crops, for livestock, for survival. Most others had already abandoned their claims, loading wagons with whatever they could salvage and heading east or west or anywhere the sky might offer rain. The town of Cimarron Crossing, once bustling with the promise of new settlement, had dwindled to a handful of desperate souls, too stubborn, too poor, or too rooted to leave. Rebecca supposed she was all three. One more season, she whispered to herself, a promise repeated so often it had become a prayer. Just one more. Her husband Thomas would have called her foolish. But Thomas had been gone 3 years now, taken by the fever that had swept through the territory like wildfire. He'd been buried on the small rise behind the cabin, beneath the only tree hardy enough to survive the unforgiving land. She stayed because leaving meant abandoning him completely, abandoning the future they had planned together, stone by stone, seed by seed. The sun dipped toward the western mountains, painting the sky in fiery hues that mocked the barren earth. Below, Rebecca turned back toward the cabin, her boots raising small clouds of dust with each weary step. The old mule, Samson, brayed softly from the lean-to shelter attached to the barn, and she paused to stroke his greying muzzle. "I know," she murmured, "water's getting scarce for both of us." Inside the cabin, shadows gathered in the corners. Rebecca lit a single candle, conserving the precious store of fuel. The cabin was simple, but well-crafted. Thomas had been skilled. With his hands, a sturdy table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the main room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently cold. A curtain separated her sleeping area from the rest of the space. Few decorations adorned the walls. A faded sampler brought from back east, a crude drawing of the homestead as Thomas had envisioned it would one day look, and his rifle, mounted above the door. Rebecca carefully ladled water from her dwindling reserves into a small pot, adding dried beans and the last of her salt pork. It would sustain her, though just barely. As the meager stew simmered, she sat at the table, fingers automatically reaching for the mending basket beside her chair. Work kept her mind focused, kept the loneliness at bay. The first hint of trouble came as a distant sound, not the familiar yip of coyotes or the whisper of wind through the scrub brush, but something else. Rebecca paused, needle hovering over patched fabric, and listened. Hoofbeats, faint but growing steadier, riders approaching in the gathering dark. In these parts, visitors after sundown rarely brought good news. Rebecca set aside her mending and, moved quickly to the door, lifting Thomas's rifle from its mount with practiced ease. The weapon was old but reliable, maintained with the same careful attention she gave to everything that had been his. She checked the load, then stepped onto the small porch, rifle resting in the crook of her arm, not threatening, but visible. The sound had stopped. The darkening yard lay empty and still before her. Rebecca scanned the perimeter, from the barn to the withered fields, seeing nothing unusual. Perhaps she had imagined it, wishful thinking born of too much solitude. She was about to turn back when something moved near the edge of the property. A shadow, low to the ground, dragging itself through the dust toward the well. "Who's there?" Rebecca called, raising the rifle slightly. "Show yourself." No answer came, but the shape continued its painful progress. Not an animal. The movements were too deliberate. A person then, but crawling, injured or desperate or both. Common sense told her to go inside, bar the door, wait for morning. The territory was rife with dangers, outlaws, deserters, and the conflicts between settlers and native tribes that periodically erupted into bloodshed. A lone woman with a failing homestead couldn't afford to take chances. But something else, something Thomas had valued in her, a stubbornness of spirit that refused to surrender to fear, kept her feet firmly planted. "I'm armed," she warned, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "State your business." The figure stopped moving. Slowly, painfully, it raised what appeared to be a hand, a gesture Rebecca couldn't interpret as either surrender or a threat. Then it slumped forward, motionless in the dirt. Rebecca hesitated only a moment before descending the porch steps, rifle ready. She approached cautiously, circling to keep distance between herself and the prone form. As she drew nearer, details emerged from the gathering darkness. A man lay face down in the dust. His long black hair was matted with blood and dirt. What clothing remained on his upper body was tattered, revealing bronzed skin lacerated with fresh wounds, some from knife or blade, others that could only be bullet wounds. Even in the dying light, the patterns of paint still visible on his face and chest were unmistakable. Apache. Rebecca's grip tightened on the rifle. The Apache bands that roamed these territories were fierce warriors, and relations between them and settlers were fragile at best, openly hostile at worst. Just last month, a family 10 miles east had been found dead, their homestead burned to ash. The man didn't move. For a moment, Rebecca thought he might already be dead. Then she saw the slight rise and fall of his back, shallow breathing, but breathing nonetheless. She could walk away. No one would blame her. In fact, most would call her a fool for not putting a bullet in him where he lay. One less hostile native to threaten settlers. One less mouth competing for the land's scarce resources. But as she stood there, finger resting lightly alongside the trigger guard, other thoughts surfaced. She had seen the Apache bands from a distance, families with children, elders, not so different from the communities she had known back east. And Thomas, before he died, had insisted on treating the local tribes with respect, trading fairly when opportunities arose. This was their land first, he had reminded her. We're the strangers here. With a muttered curse at her own foolishness, Rebecca lowered the rifle. "Can you hear me?" she asked, taking a cautious step closer. The man stirred slightly, his head turned just enough for her to see his profile, strong features sharpened by hunger and pain. His eyes opened briefly, dark and disoriented. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't understand. Rebecca made her decision. Keeping the rifle in one hand, she reached down with the other and grasped the man's arm, trying to help him rise. He was tall and would have been powerfully built, but deprivation had stripped him to lean muscle and bone. Still, he was heavy, dead weight in her grip. "You need to help me," she grunted, straining under his bulk. "I can't carry you alone." Whether he understood her words or simply her intent, the man summoned some reserve of strength. Together, in an awkward dance of pained shuffling and determined guidance, they made their way to the cabin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Inside, Rebecca helped him to the floor near the hearth, quickly rekindling the banked coals into a small flame. In the improved light, the extent of his injuries became clearer and more dire. 3 bullet wounds, one through the meat of his shoulder, another grazing his ribs, and a third embedded in his thigh. Knife cuts across his back and arms, signs of severe beating around his face and torso. Whoever had done this had meant for him to die, and die painfully. "Water," she said clearly, pointing to her own lips. "Water?" The man's eyes flickered with understanding. Rebecca fetched her canteen, holding it carefully to his cracked lips. He drank sparingly, with the measured restraint of someone who knew the value of each drop in this parched land. "Food is coming," she continued, gesturing to the simmering pot. "But first, these wounds." She gathered her limited medical supplies, clean rags, a bottle of whiskey Thomas had saved for medicinal purposes, a bone needle and thread, and a thin-bladed knife she kept honed to razor sharpness. The man watched her preparations through half-lidded eyes. His breathing labored but controlled. Rebecca approached him cautiously, displaying the whiskey. "This will hurt," she warned, mimicking pain with her expression. A flicker of what might have been grim amusement crossed his features. He gave a slight nod and braced himself. The process was brutal but necessary. Rebecca cleaned each wound methodically, extracting the bullet from his thigh with a steady hand that belied her racing heart. The man remained conscious throughout, his only concessions to pain being the occasional sharp intake of breath or the clenching of his jaw. When she finally tied off the last stitch and bound the wounds with clean strips of fabric, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decipher. Suspicion mingled with something that might have been grudging respect. "Rest," she said, pointing to the pallet she had created from blankets near the fire. "Food, then rest." As she turned to the neglected stew, a hoarse voice stopped her. "Nashota." Rebecca looked back. The man had placed his fist over his heart. "Nashota," he repeated, then gestured toward her with an open palm. His name, she realized. He was telling her his name. "Rebecca," she responded, mirroring his gesture. "Rebecca Holbrook." Nashota nodded once, the simple exchange seeming to drain the last of his strength. His eyes closed, his breathing evened into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. Rebecca watched him for a long moment, the reality of what she had done settling over her like a physical weight. She had invited danger into her home, not just the wounded warrior before her, but whatever conflict had left him in such a state. Whatever enemies had tried to kill him might well come looking to finish the job. She moved the rifle to rest within, easy reach of her chair, and ladled a portion of stew into a bowl. It would be a long night. She would need her strength. As darkness claimed the land and coyotes began their mournful chorus, Rebecca sat vigil beside her unexpected guest, wondering if she had just signed her own death warrant or performed the only truly human act left to her in this unforgiving place. By dawn, she would have her answer. Morning arrived with a strange quiet. No wind, no bird song, no distant sounds of life stirring across the valley. Rebecca, who had dozed fitfully in her chair through the night, was instantly alert to the unnatural stillness. Beside the hearth, Nashota slept on, his breathing stronger than it had been the previous night. She moved silently to the window, parting the thin curtain just enough to peer outside. The sight froze her blood. At the edges of her property, just beyond rifle range, stood a line of mounted Apache warriors, at least 20, perhaps more. They sat motionless on their horses, faces painted for battle, weapons clearly visible. They formed a ring around the homestead, positioned to cut off any escape. Rebecca's hand flew to her throat. This was it then. Her foolish act of mercy had brought death to her door after all. She could make a run for it, perhaps, though she wouldn't get far. She could barricade herself inside, but the cabin walls, while sturdy, would not withstand a determined assault. Or she could face them with what dignity she had left. A soft sound behind her made her turn. Nashota had awakened and was struggling to sit up, his face tightening with pain, but his eyes clear and alert. He had noticed her fear. "They come," he said in halting, accented English. "For me." "You speak English," Rebecca said, momentarily distracted from the immediate threat. Nashota nodded. "Army scouts taught me before war." He gestured to the window. "My people, brothers, cousins." He met her eyes directly. "No harm for you. You saved Nashota. They protect." Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "Protect? They look ready for battle." Nashota's expression hardened. "Men hunt me. White men, soldiers, 5, maybe 6. They come soon." He pointed to the warriors outside. "They wait. They watch." As if to confirm his words, a movement at the far end of the valley caught Rebecca's eye. A dust cloud, small but growing, riders approaching at speed. Nashota struggled to rise, reaching for the rifle. Rebecca instinctively stepped back, but he made no move to take the weapon. Instead, he gestured for her to pick it up. "You stay here," he said firmly. "Door closed, I go outside." "You can barely stand," Rebecca protested. "Your wounds must be seen," he interrupted. "My people must see. You must be seen, together." Rebecca understood then. This was about more than one injured warrior. This was about witnessing, about a statement being made that would be carried back to whatever tribe or band these men belonged to. She was being offered protection, but only if she demonstrated that she deserved it. With a deep breath, she helped Nashota to his feet. He leaned heavily against her, but his face betrayed no pain. Together, they stepped onto the porch, just as the distant riders came into clear view. 6 men in partial military uniform, riding hard toward the homestead. The Apache warriors remained, motionless, watching. Rebecca felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as she stood supporting the injured man. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression calm, her posture straight. Nashota said something in his own language, a greeting, a command, she couldn't tell, but the effect was immediate. Several of the warriors raised their weapons into the air in acknowledgement. The approaching riders slowed, clearly registering the ring of armed Apache surrounding the homestead. They pulled up about 100 yards away, conferring amongst themselves. Even at this distance, Rebecca could see the tension in their postures, the calculations being made. Nashota spoke again, his voice carrying surprising strength across the still morning air. "They hunt me like animal," he said, switching to English for her benefit. "Army men, not real soldiers, scouts, trackers, paid for Apache scalps." Rebecca's stomach turned. She had heard rumors of bounty hunters operating in the territory, men who blurred the lines between military action and outright murder for profit. Men who didn't distinguish between hostile warriors and peaceful bands. Men who collected their payment by the body count. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why you specifically?" Nashota's expression darkened. "I was scout too. For blue coats. Saw what these men do. Reported to Commander." A bitter smile twisted his lips. "Commander dead now. No one left who knows truth." The bounty hunters spread out slightly, clearly assessing their options against the superior numbers surrounding them. Their leader, a hard-faced man with a distinctive red kerchief around his neck, shouted across the distance. "That's army property you're harboring, ma'am. Dangerous renegade. Turn him over and we'll be on our way." Rebecca felt Nashota tense beside her. Without thinking, she shifted slightly, placing herself more firmly between him and the hunters. "This man is under my protection," she called back, her voice carrying a confidence she didn't entirely feel. And it seems I'm not the only one protecting him. I suggest you move on." The leader laughed, an ugly sound that carried easily on the still air. "You're making a mistake, lady. That savage will slit your throat first chance he gets. We're doing you a favor." Before Rebecca could respond, one of the Apache warriors separated from the line, riding forward until he was halfway between the homestead and the bounty hunters. He sat tall and proud, adorned with more elaborate decoration than the others, a leader of some kind. The bounty hunter's hand drifted to his sidearm, but he didn't draw. The odds were not in his favor, and everyone present knew it. The Apache warrior spoke in his native tongue, words flowing like water over stone. Though Rebecca couldn't understand the language, the intent was clear from his tone and bearing, a warning, a declaration of protection. The bounty hunter's leader scowled, his hand still hovering near his gun. For a breathless moment, violence seemed imminent. Then, with a curt gesture to his men, he wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over," he shouted over his shoulder. "Nobody crosses Silas Harding and lives to tell about it." The threat hung in the air as the men galloped away, dust plumes marking their retreat down the valley. As they disappeared from sight, Rebecca became acutely aware that she now stood alone, a white settler woman, in the midst of what could only be described as an Apache war party. Nashota's weight against her side suddenly felt precarious rather than reassuring. The warrior who had confronted the bounty hunters turned his horse toward the cabin and approached at a measured pace. Up close, his face was lined with experience, his eyes sharp with intelligence and authority. He stopped a respectful distance away, studying Rebecca with an unreadable expression. Nashota straightened as much as his wounds would allow, speaking rapidly in their shared language. The exchange continued for several minutes, with occasional glances toward Rebecca. She stood her ground, though her legs had begun to tremble with the strain of supporting both herself and the injured man. Finally, the leader nodded once, decisively. He turned to Rebecca and spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "I am Chief Kitanis. Nashota is my brother's son. He tells me you removed bullets, closed wounds, shared water and food." He gestured to the ring of warriors. "We watched this place since dawn, saw no husband, no men. Just one woman with courage, like a mountain lion." Rebecca swallowed hard. "I did what any decent person would do." Chief Kitanis's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. Many decent people would shoot Apache first, ask questions never. He looked around at the homestead, taking in the failing crops, the emptying well, the signs of struggle against the unforgiving land. "You stay when others leave. Why?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. "This is my home," she answered simply. "My husband is buried here. Our dreams are in this soil, even if the rain isn't." The chief considered her words, then nodded as if she had passed some test. "Nashota says men who hunt him will return, with more guns, more hate." He gestured to his warriors. "We will stay. Guard this place. Guard you." Rebecca blinked in astonishment. "You would protect a white settler's homestead?" "We protect one who protects our blood," Kitanis corrected firmly. "Old ways say debt must be paid. Life for life." As his words settled over her, Rebecca realized that the empty stillness she had felt upon waking had transformed into something else entirely. A fragile moment of unexpected alliance, of humanity recognized across the divide of race and conflict. Nashota's weight sagged more heavily against her, reminding her of the immediate concerns at hand. "He needs to lie down," she said to the chief. "His wounds are severe." Kitanis made a quick gesture, and two warriors dismounted, approaching to take Nashota's weight from her. Before they led him inside, Nashota caught Rebecca's gaze, his dark eyes intense with an emotion she couldn't name. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of a vow. As the warriors helped Nashota into the cabin, Chief Kitanis turned back to Rebecca. My men will make camp, he stated. Some will watch from hills, some will stay close. We have food, water. He paused, then added, we also have seeds, ones that grow with little rain. Trade secret. The offering was unexpected, not just protection, but knowledge that might mean survival beyond the immediate crisis. Rebecca felt a tightness in her throat that had nothing to do with fear. I would be grateful for such wisdom, she managed to say. Kitanis nodded, satisfied. Then it is decided. He gestured toward the distant horizon where the bounty hunters had disappeared. They will come again. When they do, they will find not just one lioness defending her den, but a tribe defending its own. As the chief rode back to his men, Rebecca stood on her porch, watching as the Apache warriors began to establish positions around her property with practiced efficiency. The morning sun rose higher, burning away the brief moment of coolness, promising another day of unrelenting heat. Yet, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rebecca felt something stir within her that she had thought long buried in the parched earth alongside Thomas. Hope. One act of mercy, one moment of seeing humanity instead of threat, had transformed her isolated struggle into something unexpected. Not just a chance at survival, but a possibility that transcended the rigid boundaries drawn by fear and prejudice. As she turned to check on her patient, Rebecca couldn't know that the decision to shelter one wounded warrior would spark a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about belonging, about justice, and about the true meaning of home. The next 3 days brought a transformation to Rebecca's homestead, unlike anything she could have imagined. The Apache warriors established a perimeter that extended well beyond her property lines, with lookouts posted on the distant ridges and regular patrols circling the boundaries. Some brought their families, women and children who set up camp at a respectful distance from the cabin, their presence both comforting and alien to Rebecca's solitary existence. Inside the cabin, Nashota's recovery progressed with remarkable speed. The fever that had spiked briefly after his wounds were treated broke by the second day, and by the third he could sit up and move about with minimal assistance. Rebecca had seen men with lesser injuries linger near death for weeks, yet the Apache warrior seemed to possess some innate resilience that defied conventional understanding of healing. Your people seem to know much about medicine, she remarked as she changed his bandages on the morning of the 4th day. The wounds were already showing signs of healthy mending, the angry red inflammation giving way to the pink of new tissue. Nashota nodded, watching her careful ministrations. Many plants here have power. White men see weeds, we see medicine. Rebecca finished securing the fresh wrapping around his shoulder. Perhaps you could teach me someday, she said, more to herself than to him. Our medicines from back east don't always work well out here. I will show you, he replied, his English improving daily, when I can walk better. Their conversations had grown less hesitant, built on a foundation of mutual necessity, but evolving into something like cautious friendship. Nashota told her of his time as a scout for the army, tracking hostile bands that threatened settlements. He spoke of the commander who had treated him with respect, who had taught him English and trusted his judgment, and he spoke with quiet intensity of the day he had witnessed Silas Harding and his men massacre a peaceful band that had already agreed to relocate to the reservation. They were not warriors, Nashota said, his face hardening at the memory. Women, children, old ones. Harding said Apache all same, all dangerous. He took scalps to claim bounty for hostile warriors killed in battle. His fists clenched. I told Commander Walsh. He believed me, started investigation. And then he died, Rebecca finished, understanding now the full weight of Nashota's situation. Hunting accident, Nashota said, the disbelief evident in his tone. 2 days after he sent message to Fort Union about investigation, Rebecca set aside the medical supplies, digesting this information. She had heard rumors of atrocities on both sides of the frontier conflicts, but having them confirmed by someone who had witnessed them firsthand made the abstract horrors suddenly painfully real. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Surely you can't go back to scouting." Nashota's expression grew distant. "My people need protector, someone who knows white man's ways, white man's weapons, someone who can speak for them when soldiers come." He met her gaze directly. "I will be that voice." Outside, a commotion drew their attention. Voices raised, horses moving at speed. Rebecca moved to the window, Nashota rising to stand behind her. A trio of Apache riders had returned from patrol and were speaking urgently to Chief Kitanis. "Trouble," Nashota murmured, his body tensing beside her. Before Rebecca could ask what kind of trouble, there was a knock at the door. Not the tentative tap of the Apache women who had been bringing food and supplies, but a firm, almost military rap. She opened it to find Chief Kitanis standing on her porch, his usual impassive expression replaced by focused alertness. "Riders coming," he said, without preamble. "Not Harding and his dogs, army." His gaze shifted to Nashota, who had moved to stand in the doorway behind Rebecca. "Blue coats, many, maybe 20 from Fort Union." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. Regular army soldiers were a different proposition entirely from bounty hunters. They carried the full weight of government authority, and defying them could mean charges of treason or insurrection, hanging offenses in the territory. "How long?" she asked. 2 hours, maybe less," Kitanis replied. "They move slow in column. Officer leads." Nashota's expression darkened. "They come for me. Or they come because someone reported an Apache band camped on a settler's property." Rebecca countered. "Word travels fast in these parts." Kitanis nodded gravely. "Woman speaks truth. We must decide now, fight or talk." Rebecca felt a chill at the implication. If the Apache chose to fight, her homestead would become a battlefield. Even if they somehow prevailed against trained soldiers, the army would simply send more. There would be no winners, only dead on both sides. "We talk," she said firmly, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "All of us, together." Nashota exchanged a long look with his uncle. Some unspoken communication passed between them, and finally the chief gave a single, sharp nod. "We talk," he agreed, "but warriors ready if talk fails." As Kitanis returned to prepare his people, Rebecca found herself gripped by a fear unlike any she had experienced since Thomas's death. She had been thrust into the middle of a conflict far larger than herself, caught between forces that had been clashing since long before she set foot in the territory. "You should distance yourself," Nashota said quietly, reading her expression. "When soldiers come, say I forced my way in. Say Apache threaten you. Save yourself." Rebecca turned to him, indignation flaring unexpectedly. "Is that what you think of me?" she demanded. "That I would turn my back on what's right to save my own skin?" Nashota's eyes widened slightly at her vehemence. "No," he said after a moment. "I think you a brave woman. Honorable, but this, not your fight." It became, "My fight when I pulled you from the dust," she retorted. "I made my choice then. I won't unmake it now." A hint of a smile touched Nashota's lips, gone almost before it appeared. "Then we face bluecoats together." The following hour passed in tense preparation. The Apache warriors concealed their families in a nearby arroyo, positioning a small, honor guard to remain visible with Chief Kitanis. The rest melted into the landscape with a skill that left Rebecca marveling. One moment visible, the next indistinguishable from the rocks and brush that dotted the terrain. Ready, she realized with a chill, to strike if negotiations failed. Nashota insisted on standing on his own when the soldiers arrived, refusing both Rebecca's support and the walking stick she had fashioned for him. "Must show strength," he explained. "Weakness invites attack." Always. All too soon, the distant thunder of approaching hooves announced the army's arrival. Rebecca watched from her porch as a column of cavalry crested the ridge and made their way down into the valley. 20 men, as Kitanis had predicted, led by an officer whose polished buttons caught the sunlight like tiny flares. They approached with practiced discipline, the dust of their passage rising like smoke signals into the cloudless sky. The officer raised his hand, and the column came to a precise halt 100 yards from the cabin. With a few quiet commands, he dispatched scouts to secure the perimeter, then rode forward with 2 soldiers flanking him. Rebecca descended the porch steps to meet them, her spine straight, her chin raised. Nashota stood at her shoulder, his face composed in the stoic mask she had come to recognize as his warrior's countenance. Chief Kitanis and 3 of his men advanced from the other direction, creating a triangle with Rebecca at its apex. The officer reined in his horse and surveyed the unlikely tableau before him with unconcealed surprise. He was younger than Rebecca, had expected perhaps 30, with a neatly trimmed mustache and intelligent eyes that assessed the situation with quick efficiency. "Mrs. Holbrook?" he inquired, tipping his hat with crisp formality. Rebecca nodded, slightly taken aback that he knew her name. "Yes. Lieutenant James Monroe, 3rd Cavalry, Fort Union." His gaze shifted to Nashota, then to Kitanis and his warriors. "I see the reports weren't exaggerated for once." "What reports would those be, Lieutenant?" Rebecca asked, keeping her voice steady. Monroe dismounted, handing the reins to one of his men. "That a widow homesteader was harboring an Apache deserter from army service, and that a band of hostiles had taken up residence on her property." His eyes met Nashota's. "You're a hard man to track, Scout." "Not deserter," Nashota said firmly. "Escaped prisoner." The lieutenant arched an eyebrow. "Is that so? The dispatch I received said you abandoned your post after Commander Walsh's unfortunate accident." "Accident," Nashota repeated with quiet derision. "Like attacks on peaceful bands are battles, like scalps of children are proof of hostiles killed." A shadow passed over Monroe's face. "Those are serious accusations, Scout." "True accusations," Chief Kitanis interjected, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "My nephew saw what Harding and his men did, reported to your commander. Now commander dead, and Harding hunts Nashota for telling truth." Monroe glanced around, suddenly more alert. "Silas Harding has been here?" 3 days ago, Rebecca confirmed. "With 5 men. They demanded I turn Nashota over to them." "And instead, you appear to have acquired an Apache honor guard." Monroe observed a hint of dry humor in his tone. "Most settlers would consider that a significant downgrade in their circumstances, Mrs. Holbrook." "Most settlers haven't seen what I have," she replied. "A wounded man dragging himself across my yard. Bounty hunters threatening to burn me out if I didn't surrender him, and a people who offered protection when no one else would." The lieutenant studied her for a long moment, something like respect kindling in his gaze. "You're either the bravest or the most foolhardy woman I've encountered in the territory, ma'am." "I've been called worse," Rebecca said, a trace of her old spirit flickering to life. "But I'd prefer to be called honest. Nashota has told me what he witnessed. If half of it is true, then there are men wearing your uniform who deserve to stand trial, not collect bounties." Monroe's expression hardened. "Those are dangerous words in dangerous times, Mrs. Holbrook. These are dangerous times for those who speak truth," Nashota countered. "Ask yourself, Lieutenant, why Army sends 20 men for one deserter? Why Harding and his dogs allowed to hunt Apache with no questions? Why Commander Walsh die so soon after starting investigation?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Monroe's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He squared his shoulders, glancing at Chief Kitanis and his warriors, then at the ridgelines where he must have known more Apache were concealed. "I have orders to return Scout Nashota to Fort Union," he stated formally, and to disperse any hostile gathering on settler lands. Chief Kitanis took a step forward, his hand resting casually near the knife at his belt. "We not hostile unless made hostile. We protect woman who protected our blood. Old ways say this debt sacred." Monroe's men shifted nervously, hands drifting toward their weapons. The tension in the air thickened, the desert heat suddenly oppressive with the weight of impending violence. Rebecca moved quickly, placing herself between the two groups. "There's a way through this that doesn't end in bloodshed," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Lieutenant, you strike me as a man of intelligence and integrity. Surely you can see that something isn't right in this situation." Monroe hesitated, conflict evident in his eyes. "My orders—" "Your orders come from men who may not have all the facts," Rebecca interrupted. "Or worse, from men who wish to bury those facts alongside Nashota." The lieutenant's gaze sharpened. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Holbrook?" "I'm suggesting that before you decide whether Nashota is a deserter or a witness to atrocities, you hear the full story." She gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside, listen to what he saw, examine the evidence for yourself, then decide if your duty lies in following orders blindly or in upholding the true honor of the uniform you wear." Monroe looked from Rebecca to Nashota, then to the Apache warriors surrounding them, and back to his own men. The weight of command settled visibly on his shoulders, the responsibility of lives that would be lost if he chose wrongly, the duty to both his orders and his conscience. After what seemed an eternity, he gave a short nod. "2 men," he said, indicating himself and 1 soldier. "The rest stay mounted and ready." Chief Kitanis matched the terms. 2 Apache remain with woman. Rest watch from distance. As the group separated to their respective positions, Rebecca led the way to her cabin, aware that with each step she was moving further from the simple life she had known towards something more complex and dangerous. Nashota followed, his gait still stiff but his back straight, dignity evident in every line of his bearing. Inside, with Chief Kitanis and 1 warrior standing silent sentinel by the door, Lieutenant Monroe listened as Nashota recounted in meticulous detail what he had witnessed at the hands of Silas Harding and his men. The massacre of a peaceful band, the taking of scalps from women and children, the falsification of reports to claim bounties, the threats when he had reported the atrocities to Commander Walsh. "I've heard rumors," Monroe admitted when Nashota had finished. "Whispers among the scouts, irregularities in the bounty claims, but nothing solid enough to warrant action." "And now," Rebecca pressed, "after what you've heard?" Monroe's face was troubled. "Words alone are not enough to challenge an official record, especially against men with Harding's connections. He's been operating with the blessing of certain territorial officials who find his methods expedient." "Not just words," Nashota said unexpectedly. He moved to the corner of the cabin where his few possessions had been stowed and retrieved, a small leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a folded paper, yellowed and creased. "Commander Walsh wrote this. Official report. Gave to me for safekeeping before he sent message to Fort Union." He handed the document to Monroe, who unfolded it with careful hands. As the lieutenant read, his expression shifted from skepticism to disbelief, and finally to a cold anger. "This details specific incidents, dates, names." He looked up at Nashota with new eyes. "Walsh was building a case against Harding, a thorough one. And then he had his accident," Rebecca said quietly. Monroe refolded the paper with deliberate precision. "This changes things." Chief Kitanis, who had listened in silence, spoke. "What things does it change, Bluecoat? Will you still take my nephew as prisoner? Will you still order my people to leave land where we have always hunted?" The lieutenant rose, tucking the document into his uniform pocket. "I need to get this report to Colonel Davison at Fort Union." He met Nashota's gaze. He's a fair man. Old-school army. Believes in doing things by the book. And the book doesn't. Sanction murdering civilians for profit. "And what of your orders regarding Nashota?" Rebecca asked. Monroe straightened his uniform in a gesture that seemed more about gathering his thoughts than tidying his appearance. "My orders were to locate and return a deserter," he said carefully. "But in light of this new evidence, I believe what we have here is a material witness in an ongoing investigation, one who should be afforded protection until he can testify before the proper authorities." The burden of decision settled visibly on the lieutenant's shoulders as he weighed duty against justice, career against conscience. Finally, he spoke. "I'll leave 2 men here," he said, his tone making it clear this was not open to debate. "Ostensibly, to monitor the situation. In reality, they'll provide additional protection and serve as a visible reminder that the army has an interest in this homestead." He glanced at Katanis. "I can't officially sanction an Apache presence on settler lands, but I can choose not to actively disperse it for the time being." Chief Katanis nodded, understanding the delicate compromise being offered. "And what of Harding?" Rebecca asked. "He won't simply disappear because you've chosen to look the other way." "No," Monroe agreed grimly. "In fact, once he learns I've been here and left without Nashota, he'll likely become more dangerous." He studied the cabin's modest defenses with a critical eye. "Which is why I'll also leave ammunition, supplies and word at Fort Union of exactly where I've been and what I've found. Harding has friends in high places, but so does Colonel Davison." Rebecca felt a weight simultaneously lift from and settle upon her shoulders. The immediate danger of Nashota being taken away had passed, but in its place came a new reality. Her homestead was now officially a point of contention between powerful forces beyond her control. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said simply, "for listening." Monroe met her gaze directly. "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Holbrook. This situation is far from resolved, and you've placed yourself squarely in the middle of something that could turn ugly very quickly." A hint of reluctant admiration colored his tone. "Though I'm beginning to think you're exactly where you've chosen to be." As the lieutenant departed to arrange the details with his men, Rebecca stood on her porch watching the careful choreography of soldiers and Apache warriors, maintaining their respective distances while communicating their intentions through posture and positioning. 2 cultures with centuries of mistrust between them, navigating a temporary peace on her small patch of drought-stricken earth. Nashota joined her, moving more easily now, but still favoring his injured leg. "Lieutenant is good man," he observed. "Dangerous thing to be good man in bad times. Like being a truthful scout in a company of liars," Rebecca replied. She looked at him sideways. "Or a widow who chooses to shelter a wounded Apache instead of shooting him." A rare smile crossed Nashota's face, transforming his stoic features. "We are all dangerous then." "Yes," Rebecca agreed, watching as the main body of cavalry prepared to depart, leaving behind 2 soldiers who looked distinctly uncomfortable with their assignment, "and I think we're about to discover just how dangerous Silas Harding can be when cornered." The lieutenant mounted his horse, exchanged a final word with his men, then raised his hand in a formal salute toward Rebecca before leading his column back up the ridge and out of the valley. The dust of their passage had barely settled when Chief Kitanis approached, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. "Blue Coat leaves 2 men, he said, nodding toward the soldiers who were setting up a small camp near the barn. "But Harding will bring more, many more, when he learns what has happened." "Then we'll be ready," Rebecca replied with more confidence than she felt. "Your warriors, the lieutenant's men, whatever supplies we can gather." The chief studied her with ancient eyes that had seen too many broken promises, too many betrayals. Why you fight this fight, woman? Not your people, not your war. Rebecca looked out over the parched land that had taken her husband, her hopes, nearly her will to continue. The land that had somehow, against all odds, delivered to her doorstep. Not just a cause worth fighting for, but people willing to stand beside her. You're wrong, she said quietly. This is my land. These are my neighbors. This is my fight. She met his gaze steadily. And I aim to win it. As the sun dipped toward the western horizon, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Rebecca's homestead had become something it had not been since Thomas's death. A place of purpose, of community, of stubborn resistance against the cruelties that thrived in lawless lands. The Apache women moved confidently between cooking fires, preparing the evening meal. Warriors sharpened weapons and repaired equipment, occasionally exchanging wary nods with the two army soldiers who had established their small camp with military precision. Nashota sat with a group of elders, deep in conversation, occasionally glancing toward the cabin where Rebecca was taking inventory of their supplies. None of them could know that miles away Silas Harding was gathering his forces, not just his 5 bounty hunters, but a dozen more men drawn by promises of easy, money and Apache blood. None of them could foresee the storm that was building, the violence that would soon break upon this fragile alliance like a flash flood through a narrow canyon. But as darkness claimed the land and the campfires cast their warm glow across the yard, there was a sense of something powerful taking root. A shared defiance, a collective determination that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Rebecca stood at her door watching as Chief Kitanis performed some kind of blessing or ceremony, moving among his people with solemn dignity. When he reached the edge of the soldiers' camp, he paused, then deliberately included them in the ritual, offering a pinch of some sacred substance to the flames of their fire. The younger of the two soldiers looked alarmed, but the older one, a weathered sergeant with eyes that had seen too much frontier hardship, accepted the gesture with a respectful nod. It was a small moment, unnoted by history, but profound in its significance, a recognition of common humanity in the face of approaching danger. As Rebecca turned to go inside, Nashota appeared at her side, moving with the silent grace that seemed innate to his people despite his injuries. You should rest, she said. Your wounds will heal, he interrupted gently. I have survived worse. The quiet confidence in his voice made her pause. Have you? Nashota's gaze drifted to the distant mountains, dark shapes against the star-scattered sky. My people have faced extinction since first white sails appeared on eastern waters. We have lost lands, lives, ways of being, but we survive. His eyes returned to hers, intense and unwavering. Like you survive, after husband dies, after drought comes, after hope seems gone. Rebecca felt something shift within her chest, a recognition, a connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. Sometimes survival isn't enough, she said softly. No, Nashota agreed. Not enough to merely breathe, to eat, to sleep. Must be purpose. He gestured toward the valley, the homestead, the unlikely gathering of people who had found common cause. This is purpose, worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. The stark acknowledgement of what might lie ahead hung between them, neither willing to soften the truth with false assurances. I hope it doesn't come to that, Rebecca said finally. Nashota nodded once, his expression solemn in the fading light. Hope is good, preparation is better. He touched his wounded side briefly. Tomorrow, I show you Apache medicine plants. You learn to heal wounds that may come. As he moved away to rejoin his people, Rebecca stood for a long moment in the doorway of her cabin, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. The same stars that had witnessed countless triumphs and tragedies on this unforgiving frontier. The same stars that had looked down on Thomas as he'd built this homestead with dreams of a prosperous future, now bore witness to a new chapter, unfolding, one written in unlikely alliances and shared dangers. Whatever came next, she would face it not alone, as she had faced so many hardships since Thomas's death, but surrounded by warriors who understood the value of a single act of mercy, soldiers who had chosen conscience over blind obedience, and a wounded scout who had seen the worst of both worlds and still believed in justice. For tonight, that would be enough. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. Dawn broke with unusual gentleness across the New Mexico territory, a soft golden light spilling over the horizon to touch the makeshift encampment around Rebecca's homestead. The overnight dew, a rare blessing in the drought-stricken valley, glistened on the sparse vegetation, transforming the parched landscape into something almost beautiful for the brief moments before the sun's heat claimed it back. Rebecca had risen before first light, driven by a restlessness that had followed her from troubled dreams. She stood at her water barrel, splashing the cool liquid on her face, when she noticed Nashota making his way across the yard. He moved with increasing ease, his body recovering with remarkable speed under the care of his people's medicine and his own determination. "You promised to show me healing plants today," she said as he approached. Nashota nodded, offering a small leather pouch. "For gathering. We go when sun not yet high." He glanced toward the eastern ridge, where the first golden rays were spilling over. "Plants keep their power best when collected at dawn." They set out. Together, a strange pair making their way beyond the boundaries of the homestead. Two Apache warriors followed at a discreet distance, watchful guardians maintaining the protective circle that had not wavered since their arrival. The two army soldiers, looking decidedly uncomfortable with their assignment, nodded stiffly as Rebecca passed their camp. "Your men follow but keep distance," Rebecca observed, as they climbed a gentle slope dotted with scrub and cacti. "They trust you to protect yourself." A hint of amusement flickered in Nashota's eyes. "They trust you not to harm me," he corrected. "Woman who saves wounded enemy is unusual, makes my people curious." Rebecca felt an unexpected warmth at the assessment. "And what have they decided? Am I merely unusual or actually trustworthy?" "Chief says you have heart like mountain lion, fierce but loyal to what you claim as yours." Nashota paused, kneeling to examine a small plant half hidden among rocks. "This one, good for fever." As they moved from slope to arroyo to plateau, Nashota revealed a landscape Rebecca had never truly seen, despite 3 years of living on its edge. What had appeared to her as empty desert was, through his eyes, a natural pharmacy. Plants that reduced fever, eased pain, prevented infection, stopped bleeding. He showed her how to identify them, how to harvest without destroying future growth, how to prepare and store each according to its properties. "Your people know the land in ways mine never will," she admitted, as he demonstrated how to crush a particular root to release its medicinal oils. "Not better. Different," Nashota corrected gently. "Your people plant seeds in rows, build fences, make land produce what they need. My people follow land's rhythm, take what it offers, move with seasons." He handed her the root paste. "Both ways have wisdom. Both ways have blindness." Rebecca accepted both the medicine and the philosophy, struck by the unexpected insight. Thomas used to say something similar, that there was more than one way to live in harmony with a place. Nashota nodded, seeming unsurprised. "Your husband was wise man. How did you know he was dead?" Rebecca asked, the question emerging before she could consider it. "Woman alone on frontier homestead, ring on finger, eyes that have seen great loss." Nashota shrugged slightly. "Not difficult to understand." They continued their foraging in companionable silence, the morning air warming around them as the sun climbed higher. Rebecca found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't for years, the constant tension of survival momentarily suspended in the simple act of learning, of connecting with the land that had so often seemed more adversary than ally. The illusion of peace shattered with a sharp whistle from one of the Apache lookouts. Nashota froze, instantly alert, his hand going to the knife at his belt. The guards who had been trailing them closed the distance in seconds, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, clutching the pouch of gathered. "Plants, riders," Nashota translated grimly, "coming from east, not soldiers, not in uniform." Rebecca's stomach clenched. "Harding, perhaps, or others who hunt Apache for bounty." He turned to her, his expression hardening into the warrior's mask. "We return. Now." They moved quickly down the slope, abandoning the careful pace of their gathering. Rebecca found herself half running to keep up with Nashota, who seemed to have forgotten any lingering weakness from his injuries. As they crested the final rise that overlooked her homestead, she saw the reason for their haste. Dust clouds marked the approach of at least a dozen riders, still distant but moving rapidly toward the valley. Already the Apache camp was mobilizing with practiced efficiency, women and children disappearing into the arroyos and ravines, warriors taking up defensive positions, the elders conferring with Chief Kitanis near the cabin. The two army soldiers stood awkwardly near their small camp, clearly unsure of their role in the unfolding situation. The older sergeant spotted Rebecca and Nashota's approach and strode to meet them, his expression grim. "Mrs. Holbrook," he acknowledged with a terse nod. "Scout, we got trouble coming." "Harding?" Rebecca asked, still catching her breath from their hurried descent. "Can't be sure yet," the sergeant replied, squinting toward the dust clouds. "But whoever it is, they ain't riding in formation like army, more like a pack of wolves." He adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder. Corporal Jenkins rode out at first light to report back to Lieutenant Monroe. "Won't be back with reinforcements before tomorrow at the earliest." Nashota's gaze was fixed on the approaching riders. "No time to wait for Bluecoat help. Must prepare now." They hurried to the cabin, where Chief Kitanis stood with several of his most trusted warriors. The chief's expression was grave, his eyes mapping the terrain with the assessment of a man who had survived countless conflicts. 15, maybe 20. "Riders," he reported. "Armed, moving fast. We'll be here before midday." Rebecca felt a chill despite the growing heat of the morning. "How many warriors do we have?" 12 who can fight," Kitanis replied. "Others protect women, children in High Canyon." He glanced at the two soldiers. "Bluecoats make 14. "If they stand with us," Nashota added, his tone making it clear he considered this far from certain. The sergeant stepped forward, spine straight with military discipline. "Sergeant Thomas Blackwood, ma'am. Lieutenant Monroe left us with clear orders to protect this homestead and scout Nashota until his return." There was a hint of steel beneath his matter-of-fact tone. "Army keeps its word." Chief Kitanis studied the sergeant with ancient eyes that had seen too many broken promises. After a long moment, he offered a single nod of acknowledgement. 14 warriors, then," he said, "against many more." Rebecca felt the weight of imminent violence settling over her homestead like a physical presence. This was no longer about one wounded Apache or a solitary widow's act of mercy. It had escalated into a confrontation that would end in blood. The only question was whose. "We need to fortify what we can," she said, forcing practicality through her rising fear. "The cabin has thick walls. The barn could provide cover for flanking positions." Sergeant Blackwood nodded approvingly. "Military thinking, Mrs. Holbrook. Were you married to a soldier?" "A blacksmith," Rebecca replied, a fleeting smile touching her lips. But he was a student of history, said more battles were won by good positions than by superior numbers. As the group dispersed to make preparations, Nashota remained at Rebecca's side, his expression unreadable. You do not have to fight, he said quietly. Could leave. Ride west before they arrive. Start new life away from this trouble. Rebecca looked around at her modest homestead. The cabin Thomas had built with such hope, the well they had dug together, the fields they had planted season after season, despite the drought's cruel persistence. Then she looked at the Apache, warriors positioning themselves with silent efficiency, at the sergeant shouting orders to his nervous corporal, at the land itself, harsh but beautiful in its wild dignity. This is my home, she said simply, and these are my friends now. I don't abandon either. Something flickered in Nashota's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or concern, or some emotion that had no easy translation between their worlds. He touched his fingers briefly to her arm, the gesture conveying what words could not, then turned to join the warriors, preparing for battle. The next few hours passed in a blur of grim preparation. Windows were reinforced with furniture barricades. Ammunition was distributed and positions assigned. Water barrels were filled in case of fire. The Apache women who had chosen to stay despite the danger prepared bandages and medicines, their faces composed with the stoic acceptance of those who had lived too long with conflict. Rebecca worked alongside them, her mind focused on practical tasks to keep the fear at bay. As she stuffed a pillowcase with sand to reinforce a vulnerable window, she realized with sudden clarity that she was preparing for a battle on American soil, not against foreign invaders or hostile natives, but against men who wore the pretense of law while desecrating its meaning. By mid-morning, the riders were close enough to make out individual figures. Rebecca stood on her porch, a spyglass Thomas had brought west clutched in her trembling hand. Through the lens, she confirmed what they had feared. Silas Harding led the column, his red kerchief visible even at this distance. Behind him rode at least 15 men, a motley collection of hard-faced fortune-seekers, discharged soldiers, and frontier predators drawn by the promise of Apache bounties. Armed to the teeth, she reported to the small council gathered at the cabin door. Rifles, sidearms, what looks like dynamite on the packhorses. Chief Kitanis's expression darkened. They come to destroy, not just kill. They'll have to get past us first, Sergeant Blackwood said grimly, checking the action on his service rifle for the third time. The young corporal beside him looked pale but determined, his knuckles white around his weapon. Nashota, who had been silent during the preparations, finally spoke. One chance to avoid blood, he said, looking at Rebecca. Harding wants me. If I surrender— No, she interrupted fiercely. They'd kill you, then likely kill everyone else to eliminate witnesses. Harding can't afford to leave anyone alive who knows what he's done. The sergeant nodded in agreement. The lieutenant showed me that report before he left. Men like Harding don't stop at one murder to cover their tracks. As they spoke, the riders halted about 300 yards from the homestead, clearly assessing the defensive preparations visible around the property. After a brief consultation, 2 men detached from the group and rode forward at a measured pace, stopping well within rifle range but maintaining a prudent distance. Harding's voice carried easily across the open ground, amplified by the valley's natural acoustics. Mrs. Holbrook, we've come for the Apache deserter. Send him out and we'll be on our way. No need for a widow lady to get caught up in ugly business. Rebecca stepped forward, positioning herself at the edge of her porch where she would be clearly visible. Mr. Harding, she called back, keeping her voice steady. Lieutenant Monroe of the 3rd Cavalry has placed this homestead under military protection. Scout Nashota is a witness in an army investigation. Any action against him will be considered an attack on the United States Army. A ripple of unease passed through Harding's men, visible even at this distance. Several exchanged glances, clearly not having anticipated military involvement. Harding himself stiffened in the saddle, his face darkening with anger. "I don't see. No cavalry company, lady," he shouted back. "Just a couple of bluebellies who'll be smart enough to look the other way if they know what's good for them." Sergeant Blackwood stepped up beside Rebecca, his service rifle held casually but visibly. "United States Army ain't in the habit of looking the other way, Harding," he called. "Lieutenant Monroe's already on his way to Fort Union with evidence of your activities. The only smart play for you is to ride away while you still can." This time, the unease among Harding's men was more pronounced. 3 riders actually backed their horses several paces, clearly reconsidering their participation in what had suddenly become far more complicated than a simple bounty collection. Harding noticed the wavering resolve and turned on his men with a snarl, words inaudible at this distance, but their effect evident in how quickly the dissent was quelled. When he faced the homestead again, his expression had hardened into something beyond mere anger, a cold, calculating hatred that sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. "1 hour," he shouted. "1 hour to send out the Apache and any evidence he's carrying. After that we come in shooting, and we won't be particular about who gets hit." With that final threat hanging in the air, the 2 riders rejoined their company, which withdrew to a position just beyond the nearest ridge, out of sight, but still close enough to return quickly. As Rebecca turned back to the waiting defenders, she saw the impact of Harding's ultimatum written on their faces. Fear, resignation, determination, a kaleidoscope of human emotion in the face of impending violence. "He's giving us time to argue among ourselves," Sergeant Blackwood observed shrewdly. "Hoping we'll fracture." Nashota nodded, his expression grim. "Old tactic. Divide enemies, make them fight each other, then strike when they are weak." Chief Katanis spoke a few sharp words in Apache, and his warriors responded with stoic nods. Whatever he had said, it had strengthened their resolve. "My men understand what comes," the chief explained to Rebecca. "They choose to stand, for honor, for justice, for future of our people." Rebecca looked around at the unlikely alliance gathered on her homestead. Apache warriors, army soldiers, a widow who had found unexpected strength in desperate circumstances. "Then we stand together," she said firmly, "and we make sure Harding regrets his choice." As they dispersed to their positions, Nashota touched Rebecca's arm, holding her back for a moment. "If battle comes," he said quietly, "stay in cabin, center room, away from windows." Rebecca bristled slightly at what seemed like an attempt to sideline her. "I can shoot as well as any man here. Thomas made sure of that." "Not question of skill," Nashota replied, his dark eyes intense. "Question of purpose. You are heart of this." He gestured around at the defenders. "Why we fight, we. The proof that different people can stand together against wrong." His hand tightened briefly on her arm. "If you fall, reason falls with you." Before she could respond, he was gone, moving with fluid grace to join the warriors concealed along the eastern approach. Rebecca stood alone for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words and the responsibility they placed upon her shoulders. Inside the cabin, she found the 2 Apache women who had stayed to help with the wounded, calmly preparing. Bandages and medicines collected during the morning's expedition. They looked up as she entered, their faces showing neither fear nor doubt, only the steady resilience of those who had lived too long with conflict. "You teach him different way," the older woman said in halting English, nodding toward where Nashota had gone. "Our men know only fighting to survive. You show him protecting can be stronger than destroying." Rebecca hadn't expected this insight from those she had thought of as stoic observers. "I only did what seemed right," she said simply. The younger woman smiled, a fleeting expression that transformed her serious face. "Right thing is rare flower in desert. Many die of thirst before finding it. The hour passed with agonizing slowness, marked by the sun's steady climb toward its zenith. Rebecca moved between the cabin and the various defensive positions, carrying water, checking preparations, offering what encouragement she could to the men who had chosen to stand with her. The Apache warriors acknowledged her with quiet nods of respect. The two soldiers maintained their military bearing but couldn't quite hide their nervousness as 0 hour approached. Sergeant Blackwood, positioned at a reinforced window with clear sightlines to the eastern approach, studied the ridge where Harding's men had withdrawn. "They're splitting up," he reported grimly, "moving to surround us, planning to hit from multiple sides at once." Rebecca felt her mouth go dry. How many directions? 3, looks like. Main force still to the east, but smaller groups circling north and south. The sergeant's weathered face showed no fear, only the calculating assessment of a veteran soldier. "Smart move, forces us to divide our defense." Chief Kitanis, who had joined them at the window, nodded in agreement. "We are fewer, cannot cover all approaches with same strength. Then we focus on the main force," Rebecca said, thinking aloud. "If we can break Harding's direct attack, the others might lose heart." Nashota appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Time is up," he said simply. "They come." As if to punctuate his words, a rifle shot cracked across the valley. The bullet, splintering wood just inches from the window. Rebecca instinctively ducked, heart hammering against her ribs. "To positions!" Sergeant Blackwood barked, military training taking over. "Hold your fire until they're in range. Make every shot count." The battle for Rebecca's homestead had begun. The first wave came from the east as expected. 8 riders charging across the open ground, firing as they came. Bullets whined through the air, thudding into wooden walls, shattering the single glass window Rebecca had cherished as her one luxury. The defenders held their fire with disciplined restraint, allowing the attackers to commit fully to their charge. When the riders were less than 100 yards out, Chief Kitanis gave a sharp command in Apache, and the world erupted in coordinated gunfire. 2 riders fell immediately, their horses rearing in confusion. A third clutched his arm, losing control of his mount, which veered wildly off course. The remaining 5 scattered, seeking cover where little existed in the open approach to the homestead. "South side!" Sergeant Blackwood shouted, already moving. To reinforce the position, they're using the first attack as a diversion. Rebecca rushed to the southern window, rifle ready. Through the narrow gap in the barricade, she saw 4 men advancing on foot, using the sparse vegetation as cover, working their way toward the barn. If they reached it, they would have a protected position to fire directly into the cabin. Without hesitation, she sighted down the barrel and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report deafening in the confined space. One of the advancing men stumbled, grabbing his thigh. Not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. The Apache woman beside her handed Rebecca a loaded replacement rifle with fluid efficiency, taking the spent one to reload. Outside, the battle intensified. Shouts, gunfire, the screams of wounded men and panicked horses creating a hellish cacophony. Through it all, Rebecca maintained a strange clarity of purpose. This was no longer about her homestead or even about Nashota. This was about standing against men who believed their greed and hatred gave them the right to destroy lives with impunity. This was about drawing a line in the desert sand that said, no further. A thunderous explosion rocked the cabin, sending dust raining from the ceiling beams. "Dynamite!" someone shouted. "They're trying to flush us out!" Rebecca steadied herself against the wall, ears ringing from the blast. Through the window, she saw that the explosion had torn a ragged hole in her barn wall. Flames began to lick at the dry wood, spreading with terrifying speed in the arid conditions. "The horses," she gasped, suddenly remembering the animals still stabled inside. Without thinking, she moved toward the door, only to be caught firmly by Nashota, who had materialized from the chaos. "No," he said firmly, his grip unyielding. "Trap to draw us out." Even as he spoke, 3 Apache warriors were already racing toward the barn, using the smoke as cover. They emerged moments later, leading the terrified animals, including Rebecca's faithful mule. A bullet kicked up dust at their heels, but they made it to safety behind the cabin's sturdy walls. The fighting continued with brutal intensity, neither side gaining clear advantage. Harding's men had the numbers, but the defenders had position and the desperate clarity of those fighting for survival rather than profit. As the sun reached its highest point, casting harsh shadows across the battlefield, a new sound cut through. The gunfire, a bugle call, distant but clear, sounding the army's distinctive cavalry charge. Every head turned toward the western ridge, where a dust cloud heralded approaching riders. For a breathless moment, both sides froze, uncertain which way this new development would shift the balance. Then the front riders crested the rise, and sunlight glinted off brass buttons and drawn sabers. Lieutenant Monroe led a column of at least 30 cavalry soldiers at full gallop toward the homestead, the American flag snapping proudly above their formation. A ragged cheer went up from the defenders. Among Harding's forces, confusion turned to panic. Those still mounted wheeled their horses and fled. Others threw down their weapons, hands raised in surrender. Silas Harding, seeing his opportunity for easy victory evaporate, turned his rage toward the cabin. With a roar of fury, he charged directly for the porch, pistol blazing. Rebecca, still at the window, felt a bullet whistle past her cheek, close enough that she could feel its passage disturb the air. Before anyone could react, Nashota was through the door, leaping from the porch with predatory grace to meet Harding's charge. The 2 men collided with bone-jarring force, tumbling to the ground in a desperate grapple for the bounty hunter's weapon. Rebecca watched in horror as they rolled in the dust, locked in a lethal embrace. Harding was heavier, stronger, fueled by hatred and fear of justice, but Nashota fought with the accumulated skill of a lifetime spent surviving against overwhelming odds. When they finally separated, both men were bloodied. Harding still clutched his pistol, now aimed squarely at Nashota's chest. A terrible smile spread across the bounty hunter's face. "You cost me everything, you red devil," he snarled, "but I'll still collect one last bounty." His finger tightened on the trigger, and a single shot cracked across the yard. Harding staggered, a look of almost comical surprise crossing his features as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest. He turned slowly to see Rebecca standing on the porch, Thomas's rifle still raised, wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. "That's for the Apache children you murdered," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "And for trying to destroy my home." Harding sank to his knees, the pistol falling from nerveless fingers. His eyes, already glazing with approaching death, fixed on Rebecca with baffled hatred, unable to comprehend how his carefully constructed world of violence and profit had been undone by a frontier widow and a wounded Apache scout. As the bounty hunter toppled face first into the dust, the cavalry reached the homestead perimeter, surrounding the remaining attackers with military precision. Lieutenant Monroe dismounted in a fluid motion, taking in the scene with quick, assessing eyes. The smoking barn, the defenders emerging warily from their positions, Nashota standing over Harding's body, and Rebecca still on the porch, rifle now lowered, but resolve undiminished. "It appears we arrived just in time, Mrs. Holbrook," the lieutenant said, removing his hat as he approached, "though not quite in time to spare you the worst of it." Rebecca looked around at her battle-scarred homestead, buildings damaged, ground torn up by hooves and bullets, the peaceful morning now irretrievably stained with blood and violence. Yet amidst the destruction, she saw something else. Apache warriors and army soldiers standing side by side, enemies transformed into allies by a common cause and a shared humanity. "On the contrary, Lieutenant," she replied, a tired smile touching her lips. "I believe you arrived at exactly the right moment. The aftermath of battle brought a strange, hollow quiet to Rebecca's homestead. As the sun began its westward descent, cavalry soldiers gathered the bodies of the fallen, Apache warriors tended to their wounded, and the remnants of Harding's band sat disarmed under military guard, their expressions ranging from sullen defiance to hollow-eyed shock. Rebecca moved through the scene with mechanical precision, bringing water to the injured, bandaging minor wounds, offering what comfort she could to friend and foe alike. The teachings Nashota had shared that morning, a lifetime ago it seemed, guided her hands as she applied herbs to inflamed wounds, packed clean cloth against bleeding injuries. "You have a gift for healing," Lieutenant Monroe observed, watching, as she deftly wrapped a young soldier's burned forearm. Most civilians would be overcome after such violence. Rebecca tied off the bandage with practiced efficiency. "Frontier life doesn't allow for the luxury of being overcome, Lieutenant." She straightened, wiping blood-stained hands on her already soiled apron. "There's always work to be done, no matter what has happened." The lieutenant nodded, understanding. In his eyes, "My men can handle the rest, Mrs. Holbrook. You've done more than enough." As Rebecca stepped away, a commotion near the cavalry's temporary command post caught her attention. Colonel Davison himself had arrived, a tall, imposing figure with iron-grey hair and the bearing of a man accustomed to both battlefield command and political maneuvering. He was conferring intently with Lieutenant Monroe, his expression grave as he examined documents the younger officer presented, Nashota's evidence against Harding and his men. Nearby, under the watchful eyes of two soldiers, Nashota sat having his wounds tended by one of the Apache women. Despite the fresh injuries from his confrontation with Harding, he maintained the stoic dignity that seemed as much a part of him as his shadow. His gaze tracked the colonel's reactions with careful assessment. Rebecca approached, just as the colonel was handing the documents back to Monroe. "Damning evidence," she heard him say, "but politically complicated. The territorial governor has friends who profited from these bounty operations." "With respect, sir," Monroe replied with quiet intensity, "the evidence is clear. These weren't legal bounty operations. They were massacres of peaceful bands, including women and children." Colonel Davison sighed, the sound of a man who understood the difference between justice and political reality. "I don't disagree, Lieutenant, but we need to proceed carefully. The wrong move could bury this evidence rather than bring the guilty to account." Rebecca stepped forward, her exhaustion burning away under a flare of indignation. "These men murdered innocent people for profit, Colonel. They attacked a homestead protected by your own soldiers. If that's not enough to demand justice, what would be?" The colonel turned, noticing her for the first time. His eyes widened slightly, taking in her blood-stained clothes, her determined stance, the quiet authority she had acquired through ordeal and action. "Mrs. Holbrook, I presume," he said, offering a courteous nod. "Lieutenant Monroe has spoken highly of your courage. Please understand, I'm not suggesting we ignore these crimes, merely that we must be strategic in how we address them." Before Rebecca could respond, Nashota approached, moving with careful precision to account for his injuries. The colonel's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, the instinctive wariness of a career military man in the presence of someone categorized as other. "Colonel Davison," Nashota said, his English deliberate and clear. "I served United States Army faithfully as scout, showed bluecoats safe paths through Apache lands, tracked hostile bands threatening settlers." His eyes hardened. "In return, I ask one thing. Truth must be told. All of it." The colonel studied him with shrewd assessment. "The truth is rarely simple, Scout, and justice even less so." "This truth is simple," Nashota replied. "Children died for money. Women's Home attacked for trying to stop more killing. He gestured toward the captive bounty hunters. These men, no names of others involved. Officials who paid for Apache scalps without asking questions. Traders who supplied weapons. Army officers who looked away. A heavy silence followed his words. Colonel Davison's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. Perhaps recognition of the moral clarity Nashota offered, or perhaps calculation of the political cost of pursuing such wide-reaching corruption. "I'll need sworn testimony," he said finally. "From you, from Mrs. Holbrook, from Chief Kitanis and his warriors who witnessed the attacks on peaceful bands." "You'll have it," Rebecca said firmly. The colonel nodded, decision apparently made. "Lieutenant Monroe will escort all witnesses to Fort Union tomorrow. The testimony will be recorded under military authority where it can't be misplaced." The slight pause spoke volumes about his understanding of territorial politics. As the colonel returned to organizing his men, Rebecca felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through battle and its aftermath was draining away, leaving bone-deep weariness in its place. She sat heavily on her porch steps, surveying the damage to her homestead. The barn would need extensive repairs, assuming it could be saved at all. Bullet holes pockmarked the cabin walls. The sparse garden she had nurtured through the drought lay trampled beyond recovery. Even the well had not escaped damage, its wooden superstructure splintered by errant gunfire. "It can be rebuilt," Nashota said quietly, easing himself down beside her. "All of it," Rebecca gave a tired smile. "Is mind-reading an Apache skill I should know about? Not mind. Eyes." His own gaze swept across the damaged property. "You see what is lost, natural after battle. But look again. See what remains." Rebecca followed his direction, forcing herself to see beyond the immediate destruction. The cabin structure stood solid despite its wounds. The well itself was intact, still offering precious water. The land remained, harsh but enduring, waiting for new growth. And around her, Apache and soldiers worked side by side in the evening. Light, a collaboration that would have seemed impossible mere days ago. "I see it," she admitted, "but rebuilding alone—" "Not alone," Nashota interrupted gently. "Apache have debt to you. Life debt. Cannot be repaid with just protection for one battle." Before Rebecca could respond, Chief Kitanis approached. His aging face lined with fatigue, but his bearing unbowed by the day's violence. With formal dignity, he lowered himself to sit cross-legged before them. "Woman who sheltered my sister's son," he began in his accented English. "Today you fought beside Apache. Killed man who slaughtered our children. This creates bond." He gestured to the homestead. "My people will help rebuild what war has broken. We'll teach your seeds to grow with little water. We'll stand as neighbors, not enemies." Rebecca felt tears threatening, not from grief or fear, but from the unexpected gift of community after years of isolated struggle. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the words inadequate for the offering. Chief Kitanis nodded, then turned to Nashota, speaking in their native tongue. A brief but intense exchange followed, with Nashota responding with evident surprise. Finally, the chief rose and departed, leaving nephew and homesteader in momentary silence. "What did he say?" Rebecca asked, curious at Nashota's expression. "He offers choice," Nashota replied slowly. "After testimony at fort, I can return to tribe as honored warrior, help lead our people through changing times." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Or I can stay here, be bridge between your world and mine." The implication hung in the air between them. This was more than an offer of assistance. With rebuilding, it was a recognition of the connection that had formed between them, unexpected, complicated by cultural difference and historical conflict, but undeniably real. "And what will you choose?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nashota looked out across the valley, now painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. My people follow seasons, move with need, always have. His gaze returned to her, intent and unguarded. But sometimes roots must grow deep to survive drought, find water beneath hard ground. Rebecca understood the poetry in his practical analogy. There would be difficulties, she said, not as discouragement but as acknowledgement of reality. The territory isn't kind to Apache and white woman together. Nashota finished with unexpected directness. No, not kind, but world changes. Sometimes quickly like flash flood, sometimes slow like river-shaping stone. His hand found hers on the weathered porch step. Worth trying, worth fighting for. The simple touch conveyed more than elaborate declarations could have. Respect, understanding, the promise of partnership rather than possession. Rebecca looked down at their joined hands, hers pale and work-roughened, his bronze and scarred, both equally capable of violence and tenderness. I would welcome your help, she said carefully, in rebuilding this place, in creating something that honors both our ways. Nashota's rare smile emerged, transforming his solemn features. Then I stay, after fort, after testimony. He gestured toward the Apache camp where preparations for evening were underway. My people will visit, trade, learn from you as you learn from us. As twilight deepened across the valley, Rebecca found herself surrounded by an unlikely gathering around her cabin's hearth. Lieutenant Monroe and Sergeant Blackwood represented the Army's more enlightened elements. Chief Katanis and several elders brought the wisdom of the Apache tradition. And at her side sat Nashota, embodying the possibility of bridging worlds. Long divided by fear and misunderstanding, they spoke of practical matters, the journey to Fort Union for testimony, arrangements for rebuilding, provisions for the coming winter. But beneath these discussions ran a current of something far more significant, the recognition that what had happened at this remote homestead might represent a small but meaningful challenge to the accepted order of the frontier. The Territorial. Papers will want to report on this, Lieutenant Monroe observed. A settler woman defended by Apache warriors against corrupt bounty hunters makes for compelling reading. Will they tell truth? Chief Katanis asked skeptically, or make Apache savages woman victim, bluecoats heroes? That depends on who's telling the story, Rebecca replied thoughtfully, and I intend to make sure my version is heard. Monroe smiled, a hint of newfound respect in his expression. I believe you will, Mrs. Holbrook, though it may make certain officials rather uncomfortable. Good, Nashota said simply. Comfort breeds blindness. Discomfort forces new seeing. As the meeting concluded and the visitors departed to their respective camps, Rebecca stood at her door, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue of evening. Nashota remained beside her, his presence a quiet counterpoint to her thoughts. Do you regret it? He asked after a comfortable silence. Opening your door that night? Rebecca considered the question seriously. In less than a week, her solitary existence had been shattered, her home damaged, her future irrevocably altered. She had taken a life, witnessed battle on her own land, and placed herself in opposition to powerful forces within the territory. Yet she had also found connection. After years of isolation, purpose beyond mere survival, and perhaps most importantly, hope for a future that offered more than endless struggle against drought and loneliness. No, she said finally, I don't regret it. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But perhaps they shouldn't be. Nashota nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. Tomorrow we ride to fort, give testimony, begin justice. He looked out at the homestead, now peaceful under the emerging stars. Then we return, begin building new barns, stronger fences. His hand found hers again in the gathering darkness. New life. As night claimed the valley and campfires winked like earthbound stars around her property, Rebecca felt something she had not experienced since Thomas's death, a sense of belonging, not just to a place, but to a purpose and to people who shared it. One desperate man crawling across her yard, one moment of mercy rather than fear, one courageous choice to see humanity where others saw only threat. From these small beginnings had come a transformation she could never have imagined, not just of her homestead, but of her understanding of what it meant to truly claim a place as home. Behind them, the cabin door stood open, golden lamplight spilling out to meet the silver of the rising moon. Ahead, the future waited, uncertain, challenging, but faced now with shared strength rather than solitary endurance. For tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own healing, its own opportunities to choose connection over division, courage over fear, humanity over prejudice, and they would face it together. Autumn painted the New Mexico territory in unexpected colors: russet grasses, golden cottonwoods along the distant riverbeds, the deep blue of a sky washed clean by rare rains that had blessed the parched land in the weeks following the confrontation at Rebecca's homestead. The drought had not broken completely, but enough moisture had fallen to spark cautious hope across the valley. 3 months had passed since the journey to Fort Union, where Rebecca, Nashota, and Chief Kitanis had given their testimony before. A military tribunal. The proceedings had been tense, politically charged, with territorial officials attempting to minimize the accusations against Harding and his associates. But Colonel Davison had proven true to his word, ensuring that every statement was recorded accurately, every piece of evidence preserved. The territorial papers had indeed taken interest in the story, though as predicted, the accounts varied widely depending on the publication's allegiances. Some portrayed Rebecca as a frontier heroine standing against corruption. Others painted her as a naive woman manipulated by savages. A few even suggested scandalous relationships motivating her actions. She had stopped reading the reports after the second week, focusing instead on the tangible work of rebuilding, and rebuild they had. The homestead that greeted the first frost of the season bore little resemblance to the failing property that had existed before Nashota's arrival. A new barn stood where the old one had burned, its construction incorporating both traditional settler design and Apache innovations that provided better ventilation and temperature control. The cabin had been repaired and expanded with a small addition that served as a storeroom for the surprising bounty they had managed to harvest. Most significantly, the fields had been transformed. Under Chief Kitanis's guidance, they had implemented traditional Apache planting methods, sunken beds that maximized limited rainfall, companion planting that deterred pests naturally, drought-resistant seed varieties traded from tribal stores. The result was modest but miraculous. Where dust had prevailed for years, food now grew. Rebecca stood at the edge of these fields on a crisp October morning, a basket of late harvests propped against her hip, watching the approach of Lieutenant Monroe's familiar figure on horseback. He visited periodically, bringing news from Fort Union and the territorial capital that might affect the unusual partnership developing in this remote valley. "Mrs. Holbrook," he greeted her with his customary military politeness, dismounting in a fluid motion. "The place continues to improve, I see." Rebecca smiled, shifting the basket to offer him a freshly harvested apple, small but sweet, from the struggling tree that had finally produced fruit. "The Apache methods work. We've had more success in one season than in the 3 years before." Monroe accepted the fruit with a grateful nod. "Chief Kitanis and his people still visit regularly?" "They've established a semi-permanent camp in the North Valley," she confirmed. "Close enough for regular trade and cooperation, far enough to maintain their independence." She studied his expression, noting the careful neutrality that suggested he brought significant news. What word from Santa Fe? The lieutenant took a deliberate bite of the apple, buying a moment to organize his thoughts. The territorial governor has finally responded to the investigation, he said at last. The official finding acknowledges irregularities in the bounty system and recommends reforms. Rebecca arched an eyebrow. Irregularities is a diplomatic term for the murder of women and children. Politics rarely calls things by their true names, Monroe agreed with a grimace, but there are practical consequences at least. The corrupt officials who authorized Harding's operations have been quietly removed. The bounty system is being restructured under stricter military oversight. He paused. And Colonel Davison has been authorized to establish formal trading relationships with peaceful Apache bands, including Chief Katanis's people. The significance of this last point wasn't lost on Rebecca. Official recognition meant protection, legitimacy, the first steps toward coexistence rather than extermination. Nashota will want to hear this, she said. He's been working with his uncle to prepare for winter trading. As if summoned by his name, Nashota appeared on the path from the North Valley, leading a small string of horses laden with goods. He had changed in the month since the confrontation, still lean and watchful, but the constant tension he had carried had eased. He wore a curious blend of Apache garments and settler clothing, symbolic of the bridge he continued to build between worlds. He raised a hand in greeting to Monroe, clearly recognizing the officer's presence as significant. After securing the horses, he joined them at the field's edge, his questioning gaze moving between Rebecca and the lieutenant. Monroe repeated his news, adding details relevant to the Apache position in the territory. Nashota listened with the careful attention of one accustomed to navigating dangerous political waters, his expression revealing little, but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Words on paper," he said when Monroe had finished. "Good beginning, not enough." "No," the lieutenant agreed with surprising candor. "Not enough, but a start, and more than many thought possible before. Recent events. Recent events. Such a bloodless term for the violence, courage, and transformation that had unfolded in this valley." Rebecca suppressed a smile at the military talent for understatement. "The real change isn't in Santa Fe or Washington," she observed, gesturing toward the northern ridge where smoke from the Apache camp rose in thin columns against the blue sky. "It's here. People finding ways to live together, to share knowledge, to build something that benefits all." Monroe nodded thoughtfully. Colonel Davison suggested something similar. "He believes what you've established here could serve as a model for other regions, a demonstration that cooperation yields better results than conflict." "Colonel is wise, man," Nashota said, surprising both of them with the unqualified praise. "Sees beyond one battle to longer war." "War?" Monroe questioned. "Not with weapons," Nashota clarified. "War against old thinking, against fear of different ways, against greed that sees only what can be taken, not what can be shared." He gestured toward the fertile fields. "This is battlefield where such war is won." The lieutenant smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his typically formal demeanor. "I believe you're right, Scout, and I'm honored to witness it." He straightened, military bearing reasserting itself. "I should continue to Cimarron Crossing. Before nightfall, the colonel sends these documents for your records." He handed Rebecca a sealed packet, then mounted his horse with practiced ease. "I'll return in a month with news of the trading agreement. Chief Katanis should prepare a delegation to meet with the colonel after the first snow." As Monroe rode away, Rebecca and Nashota stood in comfortable silence, watching until he disappeared. Over the eastern ridge, the valley stretched before them, caught in the golden light of late afternoon. Not an easy land, not a gentle one, but one that rewarded respect and persistence. "Strange path that brought us here," Nashota observed. his English now fluent though still carrying the rhythms of his native tongue. One night, one choice to help instead of harm. Rebecca nodded, remembering the desperate man who had crawled across her yard in the gathering darkness, the fear that had nearly prompted her to turn away, the decision that had altered everything. My grandmother used to say that the most important crossroads don't have signposts, she replied. We only know we've chosen a different path when we look back and see how far we've come. Nashota considered this, head tilted slightly in the gesture she had come to recognize as deep thought. Apache say similar, that smallest stream can change course of great river given time. Their philosophical exchange was interrupted by approaching voices, a group of Apache women returning from foraging in the western hills, accompanied by two settlers from a neighboring homestead who had gradually overcome their initial wariness. Of the indigenous camp, they carried baskets of late berries, medicinal plants, and pine nuts harvested from the higher elevations, chatting in a mixture of broken English, Spanish, and Apache. This, too, was part of the transformation. Cautious. Friendships forming, knowledge being shared, the isolation of frontier life gradually giving way to community, albeit an unconventional one. Trading party leaves for Fort Union next week, Nashota said as they walked back toward the cabin. Chief asks if you will join. Says white woman who speaks truth, helps others hear. Rebecca considered the invitation. Months ago, the prospect of leaving her homestead would have been unthinkable. It had defined her entire existence, consumed every waking hour with the struggle to maintain it. Now, with shared labor and knowledge, with hands willing to tend it in her absence, the possibility of a broader purpose beckoned. Yes, she decided. I'll go. Someone should witness what happens beyond official reports. Nashota nodded. Satisfaction evident in his expression. Good. We build not just barn, not just field, build new way, need voices from both sides to make others listen. As they reached the cabin, the setting sun painted the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and crimson, silhouetting the distant mountains. From the north came the gentle sounds of the Apache camp, preparing for evening, drums beginning a steady heartbeat rhythm, voices raised in songs passed down through countless generations. From the south, the bell at Cimarron Crossing Church tolled the hour, calling settlers to evening worship, two worlds existing side by side without bloodshed, for this moment, in this place, at least. Rebecca paused at her threshold, taking in the scene. The cabin door that had once represented her isolation from a harsh world now stood as a symbol of something entirely different, a portal between cultures, a passage from fear to understanding, a choice to embrace complexity rather than retreat. From it, she had given shelter to a starving Apache man on a desperate night. In return, she had received not just protection, but a vision of what the frontier could become if people chose connection over division, respect over dominance, healing over harm. One small choice, in one remote valley. Perhaps not enough to change the course of nations or the tide of history, but enough to change one life, one community, one small piece of a vast and troubled land, and perhaps, like the smallest stream, enough to alter the course of the river, given time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.